Chapter 1. The winter in the Blood Iron territory did not just arrive, it conquered. It was a season that stripped the ancient pines bare and turned the earth into iron, unforgiving and hard. But inside the great hall of the citadel, the cold was met with a heat that didn't come from the hearth. It came from the soul of a queen who had risen from the dead. Aeliana Sterling sat upon the obsidian throne, her hand resting on the cool, polished stone. She wore the dragon-scale armor Valerius had forged for her in the heart of the wastes. She was no longer the fragile, weeping girl who had been dragged from this room 5 years ago. She was a living storm. Below the dais, the air was thick with the scent of lye, wet dog, and the metallic tang of old blood. Kade Sterling, the man who had once worn the iron crown of High King, was now a ghost of his former self. He was on his knees, his broad shoulders hunched forward, as he dipped a coarse brush into a bucket of freezing water. His knuckles were raw and split, the skin perpetually irritated by the harsh cleaning chemicals. He was scrubbing the same flagstones where Aeliana's tears had fallen on the night of her rejection. The irony was a jagged blade that twisted in his gut every time he looked up. He could hear the low, rhythmic thrumming of the triplets playing in the corridors, his biological children, heirs of his bloodline, yet they didn't even know his name. To them, he was just the scrubbing man, a nameless omega, whose only purpose was to keep the floors clean enough for their boots. "Deeper, Omega Kade!" a guard barked, slamming the butt of a spear inches from Kade's hand. It was the same guard Kade had once promoted for his cruelty. Now, that cruelty was turned back on him. "The Queen's floors must shine for the solstice. Do not let your stagnation infect the stone." Kade's jaw worked, his amber eyes flashing with a desperate, dying spark of alpha pride. He looked at Aeliana, his voice a raspy whisper that struggled to find its strength. "You carry my blood in those children, Aeliana. You cannot keep me in the dirt like this while a lizard sits in my chair." Valerius, the dragon lord, let out a puff of smoke from his nostrils. He didn't move, but the temperature in the room spiked instantly. The heat so intense, it singed the hem of Kade's grey shift. Aeliana didn't blink. She simply let the barrier in her mind drop. Her alpha command hit the room like a physical weight, a frequency of power so ancient it felt like the earth itself was speaking. "Kneel!" The word wasn't a shout, but Kade's body reacted as if he had been struck by lightning. His neck locked and his head was slammed toward the bucket, his face nearly submerged in the soapy water. He gasped, his lungs burning, his muscles vibrating in forced submission. "You are not their father, Kade," Aeliana said, her voice cool and detached. "You are merely the man who provided the seed for a garden you tried to burn. You will look at the dirt until you learn that a queen is not a vessel, and a mate is not a tool. Scrub, until the stone bleeds." Chapter 2. Aeliana rose from the throne, her movements fluid and predatory. She ignored the groveling man behind her and walked toward the royal nursery. Beside her, Valerius walked in his human form, a towering 7-foot presence of pearl-white skin and silver hair that looked like moonlight captured in silk. "The boy is awake," Valerius rumbled, his voice a deep vibration that Aeliana felt in her bones. "His wolf is restless today. The poison of his mother still fights the magic I gave him." Aeliana pushed open the heavy oak doors. The nursery was a sanctuary of warmth, filled with the scent of lavender and cedar. In the center of the room, sitting on a pile of thick, white bear furs, was Jackson. The boy was 5 years old, the same age as the triplets, but where they were bursts of energy and fire, Jackson was a fading ember. He was small, his skin so pale it was almost translucent, and his breathing was a constant, wheezing struggle. He clutched a wooden wolf his father had carved for him, his watery blue eyes wide with a fear that broke Aeliana's heart every time she saw it. He was the son of Livia, the woman who had stolen Aeliana's life, bedding her husband while Aeliana tended to a dying mother. Livia was now in the obsidian wastes, her screams lost to the ash, but her sins were written in the sickly frame of her son. "Jackson," Aeliana said softly, kneeling before the boy. She reached out, and for a moment her own wolf, Luna, bristled at the scent of her sister's treachery. But Aeliana pushed it down. This boy was an innocent. Serafina, the youngest of the triplets, ran into the room and skidded to a halt beside them. Her eyes, solid gold without pupils, softened as she looked at Jackson. She reached out a small, delicate hand and placed it on Jackson's chest. A soft, silvery light began to pulse from Serafina's palm, a gift of the moon goddess that bypassed the wolf spirit and touched the soul. Jackson's wheezing slowed. The tension left his small frame, and for the first time that day, he smiled. "He's my brother, Mama," Serafina said, her voice sounding like the chime of a bell. "His wolf is just sleeping, because it's tired of being sick." "We will wake him, Serafina," Aeliana promised, picking Jackson up and holding him against the cool starlight of her armor. He leaned his head against her shoulder, his small hands gripping the scales. Aeliana looked out the window toward the south. She knew Livia was out there, wandering the ash, likely plotting a way to reclaim the crown she never deserved. But Aeliana made a silent vow to the moon. Jackson would never know his mother's darkness. He would be raised in the light of the dragon wolf, a fourth fire in a pack of legends. Chapter 3. The training grounds of the citadel were a theater of raw power. Aeliana stood on the observation deck, Valerius at her side, as the triplets began their morning drills. They were only 5, but they moved with a speed that made the air whistle. Altair, the first of the Triad, moved like a shadow. Whenever an instructor's wooden sword came near, his skin would shimmer, dragon scales erupting briefly to deflect the blow. Cassius, the middle brother, fought with a savage internal heat. Every time his feet hit the gravel, the stones beneath him turned to red-hot coals. They were the perfect, terrifying union of Kade's alpha blood and the elemental magic Aeliana had absorbed in the wastes. "They are reaching the first shift soon," Valerius observed, his eyes tracking Altair's movements. "Not into wolves, but into the Triad. The world has not seen their like for 1,000 years." "They are targets, Val," Aeliana murmured, her eyes narrowing. "The other packs, they smell the change. They don't see children, they see weapons." As if to confirm her fears, a group of high-ranking, blood-iron warriors, men who had remained loyal to Kade's memory, gathered at the edge of the training yard. They were whispering, their eyes filled with a toxic mix of fear and resentment. They had followed Kade into battle for a decade, and serving a woman who had polluted the bloodline with dragon magic was a stain they couldn't wash away. "Look at the little monsters!" one warrior spat, loud enough for the children to hear. "Lizard spawn! They'll be the death of the wolf kind. I say we take Jackson and find a real Alpha to lead us." The training yard went dead silent. Altair and Cassius stopped mid-swing. But it was Seraphina who turned. She hopped down from her boulder and walked toward the iron fence, her golden eyes glowing with a luminescence that rivaled the sun. The warriors laughed, one of them reaching out to mockingly pat the little girl's head. "What are you going to do, little lizard? Cry for your—" "Kneel!" The word was a thunderclap. It didn't come from a child's throat. It was a roar that resonated in the very bedrock of the mountain. It was the voice of the ancients, the absolute authority of the first wolves. The shockwave hit the warriors like a physical explosion. They didn't just kneel. They were hammered into the gravel. Their inner wolves shrieked in primal terror, forcing their human bodies to collapse. They clawed at the dirt, their lungs seizing, unable to draw a single breath as the 5-year-old stood over them like an ancient judge. Even Kade, who was across the yard hauling a heavy crate of iron scraps, was slammed to the ground by the echo of his daughter's command. His bucket overturned, spilling freezing lye water over his legs, but he couldn't even scream. He could only watch in horror as his youngest daughter displayed more power than he had possessed in his entire life. "Do not speak of my brothers again," Seraphina whispered, the sweetness of her voice returning, though her eyes remained as hard as diamonds. Chapter 4. The Solstice Assembly was intended to be a night of celebration, a feast to honor the survival of the pack. The great hall was filled with 500 wolves, the scent of roasted meat and vintage wine masking the underlying tension. But the peace was shattered by a sound that made every heart in the room skip a beat. Clack, clack, clack. A massive raven, its feathers as black as obsidian, and its eyes a piercing, unnatural silver, began to batter itself against the high stained glass windows. With a final, desperate surge, it burst through a small pane, circling the rafters, before descending toward the head table. It didn't carry a letter. It carried an omen. Around its leg was a ribbon of cold-forged silver, stamped with the seal of the High Council of the Lunar Accord. The room went tomb-silent. The High Council were the ancient arbiters of the werewolf world, beings who had lived for centuries and viewed bloodline purity as a holy law. They were the ones who authorized exiles. They were the ones who ordered purges. Valerius reached out his hand, and the bird landed on his forearm, its weight causing the dragon scales on his skin to ripple. He untied the scroll and handed it to Aeliana. As she read the ancient runes, the jasmine scent of her perfume was swallowed by the acrid smell of ozone. The room grew impossibly cold. The Alpha command she shared with the pack allowed every wolf present to feel the edges of her rising, white-hot fury. "What does it say, my queen?" an elder asked, his voice shaking with terror. Aeliana stood up, the scroll crumpling in her fist. Her voice was a razor of cold fire. "The council has seen my children. They have declared the triplets anomalies of the sky. They claim that the dragon magic in their blood is a contagion that will rot the great spirit of the wolf. They demand that I surrender the children to the Silver Vault for permanent containment and biological study." A collective gasp of horror rippled through the crowd. To be sent to the Silver Vault was to be erased from history. "And if I refuse," Aeliana continued, her eyes flashing with a blinding silver light, "the Blood Iron Pack will be declared hostis. They will send the Inquisitors to liquidate every member of this pack, from the oldest elder to the youngest pup." Panic erupted. The warriors who had just witnessed Seraphina's power now looked at her with fear. Kade, who was standing by a stone pillar with a rag in his hand, let out a shaky, desperate laugh. "I told you, Aeliana!" Kade shouted, his eyes wide with a cowardly hope. "You cannot fight the elders. Give them the children. Save the pack. Maybe if you're lucky, they'll let me take the throne back to restore the order." Aeliana walked down from the dais. She stood inches from Kade, her white lunar aura flaring so bright it forced the nearby wolves to shield their eyes. She didn't use a weapon. She used her will. She lifted Kade off the floor, pinning him against the stone pillar with an invisible force that threatened to crush his ribs. "You would hand your own children to a cage to save your own skin," she hissed, her voice echoing with the roar of a dragon and the howl of a wolf. "That is why you are a servant, Kade, and that is why I am the queen." She dropped him like a sack of grain and turned toward the open window, her gaze fixed on the northern horizon where the council sat in their towers of ice. "Go back to your masters," Aeliana commanded the raven, her voice projecting across the entire valley. "Tell them I was a servant once, and I was an exile twice. I will not be a victim a third time. If they want my children, they can come and try to take them. But tell them to bring their shrouds, because the dragon wolf doesn't take prisoners." With a flick of her wrist, a bolt of violet lightning incinerated the raven, leaving nothing but a cloud of silver ash that drifted onto the floor. The war for the North had officially begun. Chapter 5. The silver ash of the incinerated raven had barely settled on the great hall floor before the atmosphere shifted from celebration to cold, clinical dread. In the werewolf world, the High Council did not send ravens as a courtesy. They sent them as a final warning. Aeliana stood at the center of the hall, her heart hammering a steady rhythm against the dragon-scale plates of her armor. She could feel the triplets' energy behind her, 3 distinct pillars of heat and light. Altair was a coiled spring, his wolf spirit pacing. Cassius was a low-burning furnace, his skin beginning to smoke, and Seraphina was a silent vortex, her golden eyes fixed on the doors. "They are coming, Mama," Seraphina whispered, her voice echoing with that strange, multi-layered resonance. "The men who smell like old graves and cold iron." The sound hit them first, not a howl, but the heavy, synchronized march of steel-toed boots, the heavy oak doors of the citadel, which had survived 1,000 years of pack wars, groaned and then froze. Thick white frost spread across the wood in seconds, turning the iron hinges brittle. With a sound like a glacier snapping, the doors shattered inward. 3 figures emerged from the mist. They were the Lunar Inquisitors, the enforcement arm of the High Council. They were tall, gaunt men, dressed in robes of shimmering mercury silk that seemed to flow like liquid silver. Each carried a staff of white ash, topped with a glowing moonstone. They didn't smell like wolves. They smelled of stale parchment, ozone, and the bitter chemical tang of silver nitrate. Malphus, the Lid Inquisitor, stepped forward. His eyes were like dead moons, pale grey and devoid of pupils. He didn't look at Aeliana. He didn't look at Valerius. His gaze landed directly on the triplets. "The reports were accurate," Malphus said, his voice a dry wheeze that sounded like wind through dead leaves. "Bloodline contamination. The dragon's taint has woven itself into the Alpha line. It is a cancer upon the Great Spirit." Kade, who had been pushed to the edges of the room by the arriving guards, watched with wide, terrified eyes. He knew the Council's power. He had seen them wipe entire packs from the map for less than this. A part of him, the cowardly, broken part, hoped they would take the children. If the abominations were gone, perhaps the Council would restore him to the throne. "You are trespassing in a sovereign territory, Inquisitor," Aeliana said, her voice cutting through the freezing air like a diamond. "State your business and leave, or the Dragon Wolf clan will treat this as an act of war." Malphus finally looked at her, a thin, cruel smile curling his lips. "You are no queen here, Aeliana Vance. You are a biological anomaly. By the law of purity, these children belong to the Silver Vault. They are to be harvested for study, so that we may understand how to prevent this sickness from spreading." Valerius stepped forward, his human form shimmering as a patch of scales erupted along his jawline. "Harvested!" the Dragon Lord roared. "You speak of my heirs as if they are crops in a field. I have burned civilizations for less than a whisper of such a threat." "The dragon is not under our jurisdiction," Malphus countered, raising his staff. "But the woman and the children are. Surrender them, or we shall peel the iron from these walls and the skin from your pack." Chapter 6. The air in the Great Hall turned into a battlefield of pressure. The Inquisitor's ice magic fought against the dragon heat radiating from Valerius. On the sidelines, the blood-iron wolves were caught in the middle, their bodies trembling as two gods of war prepared to clash. Malphus didn't wait for a reply. He slammed his white ash staff into the floor. A wave of silver-laced frost raced across the marble, aimed directly at Aeliana's feet. It wasn't meant to kill. It was a binding frost designed to lock a shifter in place. Aeliana didn't move. She didn't have to. Altair, only 5 years old, leaped in front of her. In mid-air, his skin didn't just shimmer. It hardened into literal obsidian plates. The frost hit him and shattered like glass. He landed on 4 paws, his body a terrifying hybrid of a massive wolf and a winged predator. He let out a snarl that made the mercury robes of the Inquisitors flutter in fear. "Stay back from my mama!" Altair roared, his voice a mix of a child's fury and a beast's command. Malphus recoiled, his dead eyes widening. It has the voice? At 5 years old?" "They are not it," Aeliana hissed, stepping over her son to face the Inquisitor. She reached out and grabbed the head of Malphus's staff. The silver-tipped stone burned her palm, the scent of her own singed flesh filling the air. But she didn't flinch. She let her white lunar power flow, the pure, unadulterated energy of the moon she had found in the wastes. The moonstone on the staff began to glow violet. Then it cracked. Malphus gasped as the feedback of Aeliana's power threw him backward into his colleagues. "I am the woman you declared Barren," Aeliana said, her eyes now solid silver. "I am the mother of the new Alpha line. You think your laws of purity matter to a woman who ate ash to stay alive? You think your silver vault can hold a dragon's fire?" Valerius loomed behind her, his shadow stretching across the entire hall until it swallowed the Inquisitors. He didn't shift, but he opened his mouth, and a gout of pure, white-hot steam erupted, melting the frost off the walls and turning the air into a suffocating sauna. "Leave," Valerius rumbled, "before I decide that your mercury robes would look better melted into the floor." The Inquisitors gathered themselves, their arrogance replaced by a frantic, calculating fear. They realized they couldn't take the children by force. Not today. But the High Council was a hydra. Cut off one head, and 2 more would grow. "This is not an end, Aeliana Vance," Malphus wheezed, his staff broken in his hand. "You have defied the elders. You have protected the unclean. We will return with the High Tribunal. We will demand the trial of blood. If your children are the gods you claim they are, let them prove it by surviving the purity burn." They vanished into a cloud of silver mist, leaving the hall in a state of shattered silence. Aeliana felt her knees tremble. She looked at her hands. They were covered in silver burns, the skin blackened and weeping. Kade saw her weakness. He stepped forward from the shadows, his eyes gleaming with a sick triumph. "You've done it now, Aeliana. You've brought the burn on them. No child survives the trial of blood. You should have given them up." Aeliana looked at Kade. She didn't use the voice. She simply walked up to him and backhanded him across the face with her burned hand. The smell of her scorched skin hit his nose, a reminder of what she was willing to endure for her children. "Watch your tongue, Omega," she whispered, "or I'll let Cassius practice his fire breath on your cage." Chapter 7. The week leading up to the Grand Conclave was a fever dream of preparation. The word had spread across the 7 territories. The Alpha King's rejected mate had returned with dragon wolf heirs, and the High Council had called for a trial of blood. The citadel was no longer a home. It was a fortress under high alert. Aeliana spent her nights as a nursery, her arms wrapped around all 3, Altair, Cassius, and Seraphina. She could feel the triplets' power growing, their internal clocks ticking toward the moment of the trial. But it was Jackson who worried her the most. The sickly boy sat in the corner of the nursery, watching his brothers with a mixture of awe and sadness. He knew he wasn't like them. He didn't have the dragon scales or the fire. He was just the discarded son of a traitor. "Mama?" Jackson asked, his voice a tiny whisper. "Will the men hurt me too? Because I don't have a wolf?" Aeliana pulled him into her lap, her heart aching. "No one will touch you, Jackson. You are a part of this pack. You are mine." "But the man in the bucket says I'm a mistake," Jackson said, referring to Kade. Aeliana's jaw tightened. She would have to deal with Kade's poison soon. But first, she had to survive the council. The morning of the conclave arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. Thousands of wolves from every corner of the continent gathered in the great amphitheater of the Blood Iron. It was a bowl of stone and ice, surrounded by the High Council's elite guards. At the center of the arena was the Judgment Stone, a massive block of white obsidian that pulsed with a cold silver light. Malphus and the High Tribunal sat on the high benches, their mercury robes gleaming under the pale sun. Aeliana entered the arena, walking between Valerius and the triplets. She wore her full ceremonial blacks, her hair braided with moonstones. "Aeliana Vance," the head elder, a woman named Hecate, announced. Her voice was like grinding glaciers. "The charge is bloodline contamination. The penalty is death for the mother and containment for the anomalies. To prove their right to exist, the offspring must step upon the judgment stone and endure the purity burn. If the moon goddess accepts them, they shall live. If they are tainted, they shall be reduced to ash." The crowd went tomb silent. The purity burn was a ritual from the Dark Ages. It involved a surge of raw silver energy that would search the marrow of the children. For a normal wolf, it was a test of strength. For a hybrid, it was an execution. "I will go first," Altair said, stepping forward before Aeliana could stop him. His little fists were clenched, his golden eyes burning with a defiance that was a perfect mirror of Aeliana's. "No," Seraphina said, taking her brother's hand. "We go together. We are the Triad." The 3 5-year-olds walked hand in hand toward the glowing obsidian block. Kade stood at the edge of the arena, his breath hitching. Despite everything, they were his blood. He watched as they stepped onto the stone. Malphus raised his arms, and the judgment stone erupted. A pillar of blinding silver light shot into the sky, engulfing the children. The scream that followed didn't come from the triplets. It came from the crowd. The light wasn't white. It wasn't silver. As the energy hit the triplets, the dragon magic in their blood reacted. The silver pillar began to turn a deep, impossible violet. The ground beneath the judgment stone cracked, and instead of ash, a wave of liquid gold began to seep from the fissures. Aeliana watched, her breath caught in her throat. The triplets didn't burn. They began to glow. "Look!" someone shouted from the stands. Altair's shadow against the silver light wasn't the shadow of a boy. It was the shadow of a wolf with wings the size of a mountain. Cassius's breath was turning the silver light into literal fire. And Seraphina. The little girl was floating, her feet inches off the stone, her voice beginning to hum a frequency that made the Inquisitor's staves explode in their hands. The judgment stone wasn't testing them, it was submitting to them. Malphus fell from his bench, his face a mask of abject horror. It's not an anomaly. It's an ascension." Aeliana stepped into the violet light, her own power merging with her children's. She looked up at the High Council, her voice echoing with the strength of 1,000 ancestors. "The goddess hasn't spoken with silence, Malphus," Aeliana declared. "She's screaming, and she says your reign is over." Chapter 8. The obsidian wastes were not just a place of physical fire, but a graveyard of the mind. Livia, once the pampered princess of House Vance, was now a creature of raw, scorched flesh. Her red velvet dress had fused to her skin in places, and her golden hair was a matted nest of ash and grease. To survive the first 48 hours, Livia had done something Aeliana never would have. She used her scent. Though she was a null, she still carried the residual musk of the blood ion Alpha Kade from their weeks in bed. In the wastes, that scent acted as a beacon for the feral rogues, wolves who had been driven mad by the silver-laden mist and had lost their human half long ago. When the first pack of 3 ferals cornered her in a steam vent, Livia didn't scream. She used the only weapon she had left, her father's cunning. She ripped a heavy, blood-soaked ruby from her scorched bodice and cast it into the dirt. While the beasts snapped at the glittering distraction, she spoke to the alpha of the pack, a beast known as Scourge. "I am the key to the citadel," she had rasped, her voice sounding like glass on stone. "You want the flesh of royal pups. You want to feast on the dragon's hoard. I will show you the secret paths. But first, you must kill the mother who replaced me." Madness recognized madness. Scourge and his pack of 30 didn't follow her out of loyalty. They followed her because she smelled like an easy meal and a way inside the walls that had always kept them out. While the great amphitheater was consumed by the violet radiance of the Triad's ascension, a different kind of darkness was brewing at the citadel's northern wall. The High Council's arrival had drawn every seasoned warrior to the arena, leaving the fortress guarded by only a skeleton crew of younger, inexperienced wolves. Livia watched the pillar of light from the jagged edge of the ravine. She was a sight of pure nightmare. She didn't look like a Luna. She looked like a demon forged in the pits of the obsidian wastes. Beside her, 30 feral rogues crouched in the shadows, their eyes glowing with a hunger that was no longer human. "Look at it," Livia hissed, her voice a wet rattle. "She thinks she has won. She thinks the goddess has blessed her bastards." She looked down at the citadel, focusing on the turret that housed the royal nursery. She knew that Aeliana had left Jackson there, the sickly boy who was a constant reminder of Livia's failure. In her madness, she didn't see Jackson as her son anymore. He was a witness to her lies, a runt who deserved to burn with the rest of Aeliana's pack. "The council has them trapped in the arena," Livia whispered to the rogue leader. "The nursery is open." "Go," Livia whispered to the shadow wolves beside her. "Enter through the scullery. Kill the sickly brat, Jackson. Kill anything that breathes. I want my sister to return to a castle of corpses." The rogues didn't need a second command. They moved with a silent, jerky speed, scaling the citadel's walls like giant spiders. Livia followed them, her fingers clawing into the stone. She could smell the scent of lavender and cedar drifting from the nursery window, the scent of the life Aeliana had stolen from her. Every step she took was fueled by a toxic jealousy that had long ago replaced her blood. She didn't want the throne anymore. She wanted the silence of a grave. Inside the nursery, Jackson sat huddled under a pile of furs. He could hear the distant roar of the arena, but closer, he heard the sound of glass cracking. He clutched his wooden wolf to his chest, his breath hitching in his throat. "Mama," he whispered, his watery eyes fixed on the balcony. A shadow fell over the room, not the protective shadow of Valerius, but a twisted, scorched figure that smelled of sulfur and hate. Livia stepped into the room, a jagged obsidian knife in her hand. "Hello, Jackson," Livia cooed, the sound more terrifying than any growl. "Mommy's home to put you to sleep." Chapter 9. In the amphitheater, the purity burn was reaching its climax. Aeliana stood at the edge of the violet pillar of light, her hand outstretched toward her children. As a spirit walker, her vision was no longer restricted to the physical world. She could see the life threads of every wolf in the arena, glowing cords of energy that connected them to their ancestors. Her triplets, Altair, Cassius, and Seraphina, had threads that burned like white magnesium, thick and unbreakable, tied directly to the blood iron line and the dragon's fire. But then, Aeliana's gaze shifted to the citadel towers in the distance. She felt a cold, jagged vibration through her mother's bond. She reached out with her mind, searching for Jackson, the boy she had left as a nursery. When she found his thread, her heart stopped. Jackson's thread was thin, grey, and brittle. But most importantly, it didn't match the vibration of the blood iron line at all. It was a false thread, a spirit that had been masked with alchemy to mimic Kade's scent. But beneath the surface, it was the blood of a common rogue. "Valerius!" Aeliana gasped, her lunar form erupting in a flare of silver light. "The nursery! Livia is there, and the boy is a lie." She didn't wait for the High Council to pass judgment. She launched herself into the air, her smoke-white wings beating with such force that the Inquisitors were knocked off their feet. Valerius shifted in mid-air, a colossal shadow of black scales that blotted out the moon, carrying the triplets on his back. She reached the nursery window just as Livia raised the obsidian knife over Jackson's throat. Aeliana didn't use a staff or a blade. She slammed through the glass, her aura of white lunar power hitting the room like a solar flare. Livia was thrown across the nursery, her back hitting the stone wall with a sickening thud. The feral rogues who had been circling the room shrieked as Aeliana's light burned their eyes, turning their matted fur to smoke. Aeliana stood over Jackson, her wings shielding him from the chaos. She looked at her sister, the woman she had once shared a womb with, and felt nothing but a cold, final clarity. "You gave me ash, sister," Aeliana said, her voice echoing with the judgment of a goddess. "You sent me to a hell you thought I couldn't survive. But you forgot one thing." Livia struggled to rise, her face contorted in a mask of scorched rage. "You were always the weak one, Barren, a dead branch." "I am the mother of the future," Aeliana hissed. She reached out a hand, and a lasso of pure lunar energy wrapped around Livia's throat, dragging her toward the center of the room. "And you are a parasite that has finally run out of blood." Aeliana walked over to Jackson and placed her hand on his forehead. With her spirit walker power, she pulled the alchemical mask away. In an instant, the alpha scent Jackson had carried for 5 years vanished, replaced by the faint, sour smell of a dark market rogue. "You bought a child, Livia," Aeliana whispered, her voice cold enough to freeze the blood. "You were the one who was barren. You poisoned my name and stole my life with a puppet pup." Chapter 10. Aeliana returned to the Great Hall, but she didn't come as a defendant. She came as the executioner. She dragged Livia into the center of the circle, throwing her down before the High Council and the stunned Alpha Kade. Valerius loomed behind her, his human form shimmering with the heat of a volcano. The triplets stood at their mother's side, their golden eyes reflecting the absolute truth of the moment. "Healer Corvin!" Aeliana's voice thundered, using the voice of the ancients. "If you wish to keep your soul, you will speak now. Tell the Alpha King why he has spent 5 years raising a rogue's bastard." Corvin fell to his knees, his face a mask of sweating terror. He looked at Livia, then at the Dragon Lord, and realized there was no shadow left to hide in. "She was barren!" Corvin shrieked, pointing at Livia. "On the week Aeliana was mated to Kade, Livia came to me in secret. She had discovered she could never conceive, and she knew the pack would never accept a barren beta daughter. She paid me to forge Aeliana's records, to tell Kade that Aeliana was the dead branch. She gave me 50,000 gold pieces to hide the fact that Aeliana was actually carrying triplets." Kade's face went pale, then a mottled, sickly purple. He looked at Aeliana, then at the triplets, realizing he had traded a dynasty of gods for a fraud. "And the boy!" Kade roared, his voice breaking. "Bought from a rogue trader," Corvin sobbed. "Livia was never pregnant by Kade. She used dark alchemy, an elixir made of your own blood, to bathe the boy in your scent so you wouldn't question him. But the elixir is what made him weak. It was a slow poison to his system." Kade turned toward Livia, his claws extending. You ruined my legacy. You made me a kinslayer for a lie." "Stop," Aeliana said. The single word froze Kade in his tracks. She walked over to Kade and looked down at him with a pity that hurt more than her anger. "You don't get to kill her, Kade. You don't get that mercy. You believed her, because you wanted to believe I was the problem. You chose the easy lie over the hard truth." She looked at the High Council, her eyes solid silver. "Jackson is innocent. He will stay with me. He will be raised as a prince of the Dragonwolf clan. He will learn what a real family looks like." She turned back to Kade and Livia. "As for you two, you wanted a world built on power and bloodlines. Now, you shall live in one where you have neither." Aeliana raised her hands, and the purity burn of the Judgment Stone erupted once more, but this time it was targeted. The silver light stripped the wolf spirits from Kade and Livia. They screamed as their internal beasts were extinguished, leaving them as nulls, human, weak, and scentless. "Guards," Aeliana commanded, "take the Omega Kade to the kitchens. He has floors to scrub, and Livia, you shall return to the wastes, but this time you go without the scent of an alpha. Let the rogues you brought to my nursery decide your fate." Chapter 11. The dust of the great hall settled, but the air remained charged with a heat that hadn't been felt in the Blood Iron territory for 1,000 years. Aeliana sat upon the obsidian throne, her hand resting on Jackson's head as he leaned against her knee. The boy's skin, once a sickly grey, was beginning to flush with the first signs of true health, his breathing finally deep and clear. Below the dais, the High King had become the lowliest servant. Kade Sterling was hunched over a bucket of grey, lye-thick water, his fingers trembling as he scrubbed at a stubborn blood stain, the very spot where Livia had been thrown down. He could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of Valerius's dragon heart from across the room, a sound that felt like a funeral drum for Kade's ego. "You look tired, Omega Kade," Aeliana said, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. It was a cold, melodic sound that bypassed his ears and vibrated in his chest. Kade didn't look up. The alpha command she had laid on him forced his eyes to stay fixed on the dirt. "I gave you everything," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry shale. "I made you a Luna. I protected you for 3 years." "You protected a version of me that you could control," Aeliana countered, her eyes flashing with a silver-violet light. "The moment you thought I was broken, you threw me to the wastes. You didn't just reject a mate, Kade. You rejected the soul of this pack, and now you will watch as I rebuild it without your iron, but with my fire." Altair, the eldest of the triplets, walked past Kade, intentionally kicking the bucket. The soapy water splashed over Kade's raw knuckles, making him hiss in pain. The boy didn't even look back. He walked to Valerius and leaned against the Dragon Lord's leg, a gesture of familiarity that Kade would never know. "Mama," Altair said, his voice ringing with authority. "The men in the grey robes are still waiting. Do we burn them now?" He was referring to the High Council members who remained on their knees in the back of the hall. Aeliana looked at them, the ancient wolves who had viewed her children as anomalies to be harvested. "Not yet, my son," Aeliana said, her gaze returning to Kade. "Justice is a slow burn, and the Blood Iron Pack needs to see exactly what their strong alpha truly was before they can learn to follow a queen." Chapter 12. The night of the solstice reached its peak, and the great moon hung in the sky like a silver shield, watching over a kingdom in transition. Aeliana stood on the highest balcony of the citadel, the Dragon's Eyrie, looking out over the glowing valley. The Blood Iron name was being scrubbed from the gates, replaced by the sigil of the Dragon Wolf. Valerius stepped out of the shadows. In the moonlight, his skin looked like polished pearl, and his long silver hair flowed down his back like a river of mercury. He stood a respectful distance away, but the heat of his presence was a physical touch against Aeliana's skin. The air around him smelled of obsidian, smoke, and ancient rain. "The pack is quiet," Valerius rumbled, his voice a deep, resonant bass that Aeliana felt in her marrow. "They fear you, Aeliana, but they are beginning to love you. That is a dangerous combination for your enemies." Aeliana turned to him. "I never wanted to be a queen, Val. I just wanted a home. I spent 3 years trying to force a bond with a man who hated my silence. And now—" She looked at her hands, which were glowing faintly with a violet light. "Now I have more power than I know how to carry. The ancestors, they are whispering in my head." Valerius stepped closer, closing the gap until the heat of his chest was inches from her. "Power is not a burden when it is shared with a fated match. Aeliana, the moon goddess didn't make a mistake when she paired you with Kade initially. He was the winter that forced the flower to grow thorns. He was the catalyst for your evolution." He reached out, his long, elegant fingers hovering near the mating mark on her neck, the jagged silver scar where Kade's rejection had left a void in her soul. As his hand drew near, the air between them began to crackle with static electricity. Aeliana's heart skipped a beat. The pull she had felt for 5 years in the wastes, the magnetic hum she thought was just gratitude for her rescuer, suddenly exploded into a roaring fire. "I have waited 1,000 years for a reason to stay on this earth," Valerius whispered, his golden eyes burning with an intensity that made Aeliana's knees weak. "I thought I was the last lord because I was meant to be alone, but the moment I saw you crawling through the ash, carrying 3 fires in your womb, I knew you aren't just a wolf, and I am not just a dragon." Suddenly, the moon above flared with a blinding, incandescent light. A pillar of pure starlight descended from the heavens, engulfing the balcony. Inside the light, the image of the moon goddess appeared, a motherly figure with hair made of constellations. "Aeliana of the earth," the goddess's voice echoed in their minds, sounding like 1,000 chimes. "Valerius of the sky, the first bond was a contract of flesh. This bond is a covenant of souls. You are the balance the world has forgotten." The silver scar on Aeliana's neck began to glow. It shifted and reshaped itself, the ugly rejection mark dissolving and being replaced by a new, brilliant tattoo. A black dragon circling a silver crescent moon. A matching mark appeared on Valerius's chest, directly over his heart. The realization hit Aeliana like a physical blow. Kade had been her alpha, but Valerius was her eternal mate. She looked at him, her eyes swimming with tears of shock and joy. "It's you," she whispered. "It was always you." Valerius didn't speak. He closed the distance in a single predatory stride. He wrapped his massive arms around her waist, lifting her until her toes barely touched the stones. Aeliana buried her hands in his silver hair, pulling him down to her. When their lips finally met, it wasn't just a kiss. It was a collision of elements. Aeliana tasted lightning and ancient pine. Valerius tasted starlight and resilience. A shockwave of violet and gold energy erupted from them, circling the citadel towers and lighting up the night sky so brightly that packs 100 miles away saw the dawn come early. It was the kiss of 1,000 years. It was the reclamation of every tear Aeliana had shed in the dark. Chapter 13. The spiritual resonance of the fated mate reveal shook the very foundations of the north. Down in the great hall, the wolves fell to their knees as a wave of pure, golden peace washed over the territory. The blight that had plagued the land since the Inquisitors arrived simply evaporated, the dead grass turning emerald green in the middle of the winter night. But as Aeliana and Valerius pulled apart, breathless and radiant, a gasp erupted from the training yard below. Jackson's small frame began to vibrate. He didn't shift into a wolf. Instead, a shockwave of white, prophetic energy exploded from his chest, knocking the triplets back. Aeliana's spirit walker sight flared. She saw Jackson's life thread, once a brittle, grey cord of alchemy, turn into a vibrant, pulsing blue. He stood up, his eyes glowing with a cold Arctic light. He opened his mouth, and a sound came out that wasn't a howl or a roar, but a high-frequency whistle that made the stone walls hum. "The seer's gift," Aeliana whispered, leaning against Valerius. "He isn't a warrior. He's an oracle." Jackson turned towards the balcony, his gaze locking on to Aeliana's. "Mama," he said, his voice sounding like a chorus of spirits. "The wastes are calling. The sister who was severed is no longer alone. She has found the father of the ferals. They are marching through the mist, and they carry a hunger that no fire can sate." Aeliana's blood ran cold. Livia was in the wastes, stripped of her wolf, but her malice was an elemental force. If she had found the king of the ferals, the peace of the coronation would be short-lived. Aeliana stepped to the edge of the balcony and looked down at the thousands of wolves now gathered in the courtyard. She raised her hand. "Brothers and sisters," Aeliana's voice carried over the wind, reaching every corner of the valley. "The blood iron is dead. The lies of the past have been burned to ash. Today, we do not rise as a pack of wolves, but as a clan of the sky. We are the bridge between the earth and the spirit." The crowd erupted into a deafening roar. One by one, the alphas of the neighboring territories stepped forward and bent the knee to the fated queen and her dragon king. They saw the Triad heirs and the oracle prince standing behind her, and they knew the era of the Alpha was over. The era of the dragon wolf had begun. In the shadows of the scullery, Aeliana Sterling sat in the dirt, clutching his mop. He watched his children rule the sky. He watched the woman he had called empty space become the center of the universe. The realization of his loss hit him like a physical blow to the heart. He had traded a dynasty for a sack of grain and a traitor's bed. He was a null, a servant, a ghost. "Let the wastes come," Aeliana declared, her eyes turning lethal as she shared a final determined look with Valerius. "We built this kingdom out of dust, and we will defend it with fire." Valerius shifted, his body expanding into the colossal black dragon, his wings casting a shadow over the entire valley. Aeliana leapt onto his back, her hair streaming like a war banner. As they launched into the sky, the world finally understood that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't a wolf's fangs. It was a mother's reckoning.
And that is the legend of Aeliana's return. From a woman left for dead in the ash to the queen of a new dynasty, she proved that the moon never truly speaks with silence. She only waits for the heart that is strong enough to listen. Talk about a satisfying reckoning. Seeing Kade on his knees with the same lie bucket Aeliana once carried, while her children rule the sky, was the ultimate glow-up, wasn't it? It just goes to show, you should never mistake a dragon's silence for a lack of fire. But the peace is fragile. The eclipse has passed, but Jackson's vision is clear. The fallen Luna and the feral king are coming, and they want blood. What do you guys think? Did Kade deserve a chance to be a father, Or was stripping him of his wolf the only way to ensure the triplets' safety? And let's be honest, who else held their breath during that first kiss between Aeliana and her true fated mate, Valerius? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one of them. If you enjoyed this journey of fire, revenge, and starlight, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you're the first to see my post anytime I upload. I'm Aeliana Sterling. Remember, your past is just the ash that feeds the flame of what you're meant to become. See you in the next story. Bye.